good morning, afternoon, whatever time it might be that you're listening to us. It is for sure time now for the Four Mortal Coils podcast. Tonight's topic, to ring in our first official recording of the new year, which, Happy New Year to you all, on the implications of dying for a cause. This is a topic idea I actually got watching an episode of the TV show House, MD. They were treating a foreign dictator, and they brought up the massive ethical question of when is it okay to basically step over that ethical or moral boundary and kill someone, or say die as well, for a greater purpose. Our life is quite possibly the number one most sacred thing we all possess. It is the fundamental thing we are built from. It is the most precious thing we have. We get it when we're born and we lose it when we die. It is the first and the last thing we will ever encounter. It is the most special thing to the human condition, is the continuance of life. Does it make sense, morally, ethically, logically, to be willing to give that up for a greater purpose of your own or of another's? I'm going to go around now and ask all you guys what your thoughts are, then we'll open the floor up to an actual discussion. So, Trevor, you first.
Cool. Alrighty. This is good to see you all again. Tanner finally coming back around for the host. Always good to see. Fucking Tanner. Looks good today. Is there such a thing as a cause worth dying for? Yeah, well, I think we should break this up a little bit because you touched on something that I think is really interesting. It's kind of like the question of the 20th century. 100 years of just factional conflict that raged across the world time and time again. And I think it comes down to this. Is there something worth dying for? I think so. I'm not we can get into why I think so later. And then after that, is there something worth killing for, which is something that Tanner mentioned? That I'm not so sure. I intuit no, and we can get into exactly why that might be a no or could be a yes, but I would intuit that as a no. And those are two questions that I think are very near each other when it comes to this way of thinking and this sort of thing. So I think that's going to be something we're going to talk about. Yeah.
Steven, you're next up in line.
Hi, everybody. Welcome again. We're on Dying for a Cause. So I would like to propose. First, we need to, kind of like Trevor said, but in a different way. We need to establish a few ground rules as far as I'm concerned. We are gene machines. We don't want to die. We have a lot of reasons not to die, but we have to. We have to address the moral implications here. We have to address many things. I would also like to mention, just on the outset, we have large brains. We have a consciousness as far as we understand it. But we have workarounds around nature, kind of around nature anyway, because of this fact, such as suicide and condoms, both of which are kind of antithetical to this whole life thing. So this is going to be an interesting topic. Tanner, I love what you said. I literally have it written down. Life is the most precious possession we can possibly have. And, what would be worth that purchase? I mean, what could we purchase with our life and so on? I think that there are some causes worth dying for, and I'm certain we'll get into them.
For me, I'm hoping to get a little bit of clarity out of the discussion tonight on this, because intuitively I feel like, well, of course there's causes worth dying for, and I can point to any number of things. I've got a whole page of things written down already on this topic, but there's also the part in the back of my head that's like, nobody should have to die for anything other than the end of their life by natural causes. We've talked about morality already on this show and how I think it has to do with well-being. And in a perfect world, we would strive to eliminate as many possible detractors from our well-being as possible, whether those be ills to our health or more ideological ills, such as political movements or organizations that threaten our existence or our well-being, which many people have gone and died for, so to speak, or died to fight against. So it's really kind of like a little miniature game of tug of war for me, trying to balance the idea that, sure, there are absolutely things that would be worth giving your life for. Whether or not I feel like I could do that is another question, and I think that goes for everybody, and that's something that I think we'll talk about too, versus the idea that life is sacred. Like Steven said, it's the most precious thing we have. Why would we ever give it up for anything? So kind of on the fence, teetering back and forth, just trying to figure out where to go from here.
Well, I guess I will start the discussion with a question, and then we'll see where we go from here. So, with these frames of reference established for everybody, when does a cause become great enough to warrant being worthy of dying over?
It's, I don't know. This is one of those things that is so fundamentally a case by case and individual basis. We're talking about life and death right now. We're talking about the thing that you have and you come back to again and again. Like, I think stories are reflective of life. We live our life through stories. I think that's becoming even more true as time goes on, as people spend time outside of like work, for example, just telling and listening to stories, seemingly more and more than we ever have before. It seems to me that life and death are the most fundamental thing when it comes to approaching reality at all. So it's really fundamental, and I think as soon as you start to look into the eyes of people as they live their lives and therefore choose their way of dying, I think that the variance between individuals becomes so incredible, so massive, so crater-like. The separation between Stephen and Brayton, even how similar they are when it comes to particular religious perspectives. Even regardless of that, I think that moment, that threshold, is so ridiculously variable between people that there wouldn't possibly be an answer that, while not true, is also just not substantive. You know what I mean? Like we could talk all day, and occasionally we can bring something up that, well, maybe not necessarily is true. It still is of substance. It's useful to visualize reality according to these means in order to better understand reality. Like there's a difference between looking at reality through like factual, true statements, and also looking at, just exploring what life would be like if I were like a monarchist and like nationalist France, something like that, like during like the Louis era. I don't think that's a valid way of approaching reality, absolutely, but I do think it's substantive to look at reality according to those means. I'm not even sure if you could do that according to this topic. I'm not sure you could. It's so variable to posit this question and find an answer. I'm not sure if the answer itself could be of substance.
I would definitely like to counter that. It seems like the more we do this, the more Trevor and I reveal our hands on maybe like subjective thought and objective thought. By the way, I would like to say in the beginning of my point here, there is no right or wrong answer to this question. I'm just saying, in terms of what we know, and in terms of our being human, to answer to Tanner's question, when does a cause become great enough to die for? I have a very simple answer. When a person, or say, let's do this right, when you care enough for the people involved, that's when a cause becomes worth dying for. Now, here's the problem. Life, Trevor, you said you suggest that there's a dichotomy here, life and death. And that's a pretty comfortable dichotomy. I mean, almost always, almost everybody would say, okay, life and death, those are complete opposites of each other. They are a dichotomy. I actually want to bring up the idea that they could be of a bit of a false dichotomy. For those of us listening, that just means that you have invented a a difference where it's not really that clean cut. Maybe there's a third stage or a third phase of life that we don't necessarily know about. A spiritualist would certainly suggest there is. They believe in an afterlife. That's a third version of life, even though it's not true. But anyway, life is an emergent property. What does that mean? In science, we determine things as emergent whenever they come from other directly measurable parts. Okay, so in biology, surely everyone here and hopefully a lot of us listening would remember that in your old biology class in high school, you learned that life has these things that it has to settle up on: food, shelter, water, and so on. Life is emergent, which means that we kind of call life depending on a set of criteria. But as everyone in this chat understands, when we die, life does not just cease altogether; it ceases for us. So we can talk about that as well. But back to my original claim, because I know all these things, because I, so to speak, believe all these things, I think it's whenever you care enough for the people involved. And we can actually measure that quite quickly. How many people can you save with your life? For example, obviously situation by situation, but you get what I'm saying. We can directly measure that.
Well, to kind of guide that a little bit further, would you say that there's a definitive number then, where if you are one life and by giving up your life, you could save 2 lives? Would that equate to something worth dying for?
Oh no, here we go.
Yeah.
Oh
see,
no.
Henry,
I've got to do it.
you brought
do it.
You know, you got to do it. You got to do it. Everybody has to ask themselves this question. I mean, if a dark archvillain approached you and said, "Hey, bud," kind of like some of these gym bros that go out here and they go around and they say, "Hey, will you take a chocolate or will you double it and hand it to the next person or whatever?"
Oh,
What
yeah,
I mean?
yeah.
Okay, so a TikTok executive becomes an archvillain and comes to you and says, "Hey, would you rather die, or will you double the number of people who have to die and then give it to somebody else?"
Right.
I mean, some BS like that. I get what you're saying here, Tanner. It's a very big question, and it's one that people have tried to answer with these measurements. We can't once again go an episode without mentioning some heavy artillery. I'm still trying to get through the selfish gene. I feel like I've made it once all the way through. I think I'm on my second reading, but anyway, my point is that there's actually one section in there where it talks about how, let's say, the gene is a selfish unit. In other words, we are gene machines. We are trying to make them, so to speak, survive. At what point does it become reasonable that our genes should sort of trigger for us to kill ourselves to save others? And you can get stuck in the weeds, of course, but if they have about as much genetic material in them as you do in your body, that you share, that's the critical point, that you share, it becomes actually very advantageous for one organism to sacrifice itself.
Let me examine the question that Tanner posed. The at what point does a cause become worth dying for? And little did I know at the time how loaded that question is, or rather how much unpacking is required. Here at the bottom of my page, I've got the sentence written out, and then of course I've underlined the word worth, because we're talking about the value of a human life, but more particularly the first person. So when we talk about value, this is one thing I almost tripped myself up on, because we've already touched on the subjectivity versus the objectivity of something like this. And when we had the last episode about aesthetics, all of our discussion about value was essentially subjective. We tried to poke some holes and say, well, maybe there's some objectivity here and there, but there's really no way right now for us to make a real claim to that. But as discussed in our morality episode, I was arguing that morality could become objective if we agree on a foundation. So when we apply this sort of scenario to that concept of well-being, that life that is being given up is no longer, or that cause that you're, if you follow what I'm trying to plug in here, it's no longer subjective in the sense that that value is no longer subjective. It becomes objective. Hang on, I'm trying not to trip over myself here. We talk about... Go ahead, Trevor, while I'm thinking about this.
I was going to say, there's kind of a subset, there's kind of an issue within that, making it objective. If you mentioned if you agree on like a certain amount of things to work within a framework, within the framework it becomes objective. But you use the word, and this becomes crucial. Agree. That's subjective. It's you have to make a choice. That is to say, you have to do something within a subjective frame. And then it just becomes more or less ideology, an ideology that sort of holds up a structure of thought and develops in complexity, just kind of like our judicial system, like laws and so forth, and laws for laws that follow after other laws to work within the system. But it is still subjective. It's just a agreed upon formula to use and then play the game in.
Right.
But it's objective within the subjective framework.
But it's a very particular. It's a very particular subjective view, and that subjective view is that you care about human well-being, or at the very least your own well-being, which is to the same point, human well-being. And so,
sure,
and it's almost a default condition for being a human being, of course, until you are astray by whatever means. So. And this is, and to that point, not to drive this too much further back into a purely moral discussion, I think what everybody is talking about when they talk about morality is essentially human well-being. We can put a bunch of different labels on it and say that we're really talking about X or Y, with the exception of maybe some religious arguments and other ones here or there that are explicitly not about human well-being, where people will say things like, maybe it is okay to own people as property, or maybe it is okay to sacrifice my son because a God told me so. Those would be exceptions. But for the most part, when people say something is good or bad, what they really mean is that it's good or bad with respect to human well-being. And so, like I said, I was struggling...
Or at least their well-being,
Right. Which is where the golden rule obviously comes into play. We should try to treat each other equally and fairly, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I was really struggling with this idea of someone giving their life for a cause, because we look at that life as valuable, and we wonder, is there some sort of objective basis that a cause could be worth dying for, in the sense of giving up a life? I'm not really sure, and obviously, like Tanner almost drug us into, utilitarianism will inevitably poke its ugly head in here, and
we'll go kicking and screaming.
I will be forced to decide whether or not I will push this rather large man over the bridge onto the trolley track to sacrifice his life for other people.
It really should be the meme of the day, the trolley. I mean, literally just pick any given trolley problem and go from there. That
trolley problem meme, it got so old so fast. My God.
By the way, something to add to the list real quick. We should think about doing an episode one day where it's just where we review philosophy type memes, and do that periodically.
That would be great.
We're going to need cameras for that. We're going to get that set up.
Yeah.
We're going to start doing it.
Exactly.
That'll take some little extra editing, but very much worth it. So Tanner, I didn't mean to kind of be long-winded on that one, but is there another place you'd like to bring this?
Well, let's see. If I've already asked what the threshold is, let's talk morally or ethically, considering the weight your own life carries. Or even taking it further with the killing for a cause, flip side of this. What do you guys think the moral or ethical implications of killing or dying, and how are they weighted differently?
I think one of us should throw out an example that we feel like we would be at least capable of dying for. In other words, like no one knows until the moment is there. You know what I mean?
Right.
Until it actually is in front of you, you don't know.
I will admit the killing flip side of this is probably easier to talk about ethically and morally. Huh?
Well, just for an example, I feel like I would be capable of dying for liberty. In other words, like if it was seriously the situation where some very serious civil liberties were under attack, I feel like I would be capable of at least trying to defend them and perhaps die in that course.
Mm-hmm.
Also, in the flip side, I feel like I would be capable of killing. Just in general, we should all accept that we are all capable of such a dark act. You know, I'm perfectly willing to accept that I could probably be capable of killing someone for something like liberty. So, you know, that's just one of those things. It's like, okay, this is like ride or die territory. You know, either I'm going to have my personal freedoms or I'm going to die about it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we I think we start to find ways of answering these questions based upon what exactly we want and where exactly we want to go. Speaking of what exactly do we want of the future? What exactly does the future scene become? Based upon our prior experience of what we think it'll become, but also what our ideal is of what we want it to become. So when we speak of dying and most often also killing for a cause, we speak of this because it seems like that is a very open possibility based upon just history and our interaction with life up until this point. But we could also speak a little bit on what like the ideal is. What exactly do we want in a future sense, not just for ourselves, but for everything, for the entire state of affairs? What exactly is, let's say, 100 years from now? Is it a subset of different societies that are all, let's say, living for a particular mode of existence? And is that one mode of existence worth killing for? Killing each other for, one another's children, that sort of thing, if you want to go all the way down. Do these sort of things exist, as dark as it gets? I think these questions presuppose particular modes of living and seeing reality. For example, I think the four of us view a lot of this in terms of like that old-fashioned liberty, give me liberty or give me death. That sort of mantra of both our American revolutionary people that came before us, but also what you saw in France that swept across Europe in the 1800s. That sort of way of existing and way of seeing reality.
Sure.
I think all of us are kind of an extension of what that is in a couple ways. So we sort of visualize reality and we live that story within our own minds and within our own actions day by day, and we can kill for those means. I think what we found here is just ways to live according to those means. And there are also people out there that also live for, let's call it the other issue of the 20th century, or the other issue of the 20th century being communism, and wanting to bring down the bourgeois and that sort of thing, and like those big groups. And those people could, we speak from experience, those people could also kill for a cause. And you have to wonder, well, is the ideal our complete total dominance, us four liberal types, over those communistic authoritarians? Is that what the ideal is? Is that what we want? Or is it dominance in that sort of way? Like, do we have the right opinion, objectively speaking, and it's worth killing over? Or what? Exactly, how does this way of thinking that we're currently thinking of, this killing for a cause, interact with the chemistry of the environment before us and what the environment will become in the next 100 years?
I would like to hop on that point a little bit and not actually disagree, but even open it up. If this isn't a good direction to go, that's fine. But Trevor, you're talking about dying for ideas and killing for ideas. That's what we're here to talk about. But we should ask ourselves, even if we, feel like we're pretty solid on this point, we should ask ourselves if we're being speciesist. In other words, why are we so willing to kill cows for beef? Why are we so willing to kill pigs for pork, and so on? In other words, do they serve some cause? Obviously, they serve our cause.
This becomes really difficult. It really does, and this touches on the veganism topic that we covered over an episode ago.
Yeah,
It's really a little bit, and I think this is difficult because I think this touches on one of like the main aspects of one of the main stories that the four of us live through today, here and now. I'm not sure whether or not it's pertinent. It's bolted to the ground. It is that I'm very uncertain of. That is not something I'm so attenuated to say that it's attached and permanent and what is. But it does seem to me, starting over again, just looking at the face of it, this veganism thing, and whether or not letting them or killing for our cause, that is to say, killing beef cows for their meat, for their flesh, or that sort of thing. Is that okay? And it's hard. It is. It is. It's really difficult for a couple of reasons. Because on the face of it, because if you really look into it, it's disgusting, it's terrifying, it's horrifying, it's all of these things. I mean, just today I saw a news article of this truck that was captured in Indonesia. This happened just today, and you can see it if you look it up. That had something like 100 dogs in it, about on their way to the slaughter. And like there was a picture taken just of like the back of the truck, and these 4 dogs that are like basically up to their neck. A knapsack is tied all the way up to their neck so that they can't move around, and they have a nozzle on their nose so they can't open their mouth. And they're looking at the camera, absolutely, totally petrified. And you could see the whites of their eyes, that thing that dogs have that make you connect with them, that make you love dogs, that weird reciprocal thing that dogs evolved. And they have that, and they're looking right at you, and it's terrifying and scary and sad. And your first thought is, when you look at it, you're like, that's the worst thing I've ever heard. Somebody get those dogs and put them into a nice field somewhere, keep them safe. You know, you want to feel that way, and it feels very natural to feel that way. But at the same time, veganism is a worry, because naturally that sort of thinking leads you towards, well, why don't we feel that way towards cows, for example? So you follow down that way of thinking, and you want to feel that way. But at the same time, and this is where it gets terrifying, if you follow it all the way down to its conclusions, it becomes a bit like yeast eating at the sugar in the bottle. That is to say, it becomes kind of a vicious thing. It becomes impossible to live. It really does.
I completely agree. By the way, Trevor, like it, especially our version of human life today would be impossible without predation. I mean, in other words, we are a predator species, and there's nothing we can do about that. I'm not trying to say that we should stop eating beef cows. I'm not trying to say that we should stop beef cow production. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just trying to pose the question to kind of, hone it back in a little bit. That's kind of why I talked about life being an emergent quality. You know, we can identify it by criteria and so on. But why is it so hard for us to say what's worth dying for and what's worth killing for? But almost all of us have this kind of intuition that a beef cow is that's kind of what it's for, and it's kind of okay, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And it kind of shows I'm trying to compare it to our human-centered struggle, at least a little. I think it shows the underlying causes that we're currently fighting for right now are themselves the right nowisms, if that makes sense. Like it's sort of the thing that's really gripping, really tightly grabbing a hold of what the four of us are. You know, like those sort of Western values, you know, of liberal secular democracy, humanist secular, that sort of thing. I think the four of us in particular are very much so gripped by this sentiment, this sort of Thomas Jefferson sort of secular humanism. And I think, and I worry about it in that it seems to be just another agreed upon set of rules that leads towards a game we can play in this sort of way. Because Brayden mentioned this earlier, and I think this is really important. He brought up this idea that we agree upon something, and then we sort of follow out the rules of the game. Sort of, we define the rules of chess, and then we play chess in this sort of way. Now, chess is completely and totally and utterly meaningless insofar as you find it meaningless. Have you ever walked into a room where there's a game being played that you don't know how to play it, and you couldn't give less of a shit about it? You know, like it's sure you can develop extreme complexity within this game based upon the preconceived rules, but that's not to say that it's important, objectively speaking. It becomes really difficult because it becomes a thing where you have to first declare, and in that sort of way establish these subjectivities, subjective rules to which you can then play this game at this time. Whether it be Brayton's humanism that he works with and uses when it comes to visualizing morality and all those sorts of things, or when it comes to the veganism perspective of savoring the lives of dogs to cows to flies, to the Janus perspective of the smallest things you could possibly imagine, or it could be the liberal secular, or it could be the communistic standpoint, or it could be dying for any sort of cause. It seems to me that we could talk about whether or not dying for a cause is such and such a thing that the four of us would like to do, and then we could start exploring the things one would die for. And I think that's where you run into sort of a hazardous ground, where we talk therefore and within what we ourselves would fight and die for. We're sort of fighting and dying for our city-state in a couple of ways. Like we go back to like the ancient Greeks. It's a bit like the Athenians would fight and die for their city-state. Socrates, as a soldier, I might be corrected in the future, but let's say Socrates, who was in fact a soldier who fought for Athens, would die for Athens. That's just sort of what was and is. He was dying for and is his family.
Well, he ended up dying for something, so to speak, I guess, in a way.
He died for a cause.
Of his own cause, but at the same time, the overarching cause of, I don't know, the ability to heckle people in the street with really hard questions, which maybe, could we consider Socrates the father of TikTok?
Why? Because I don't get it.
Because he goes. Okay, no wait, but for real, listen to this though. For one, a lot of good things said there, Trevor. I think it's really funny though that you brought up chess as an analogy alongside morality, because Matt Dillahunty uses that exact analogy when talking about the model of morality. And how it's, basically this sort of game that we created, and we made a bunch of rules up and have all agreed on the rules, and based on those rules we can evaluate, the best moves to make that produce the outcome that is desired. Not to bounce this conversation off the wall again, but I think I can maybe carry us somewhere fun. I wrote this down before we got started. Is it easier / better, two different propositions there, but we can get into them. Is it easier or better to die for a cause when at the end of your rope, so to speak, versus in a more amenable position? I think Steven said something along the lines of he would die for liberty. Yeah,
liberty.
So my question,
in other words, let me define that a little bit for you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
What I would say is that kind of going along with the language that you guys are talking about, we kind of have all agreed that we will live and possibly die. Of course, we haven't all agreed to die, but possibly die on the principle that you, Brayton, can live and die the way you want to within reason. You, Trevor, can live and die the way you want to as well. Tanner, same thing for you. Doesn't that make sense when I say liberty?
Right.
Mm-hmm. In other words, I would greet the possibility of dying for a cause if it were dying for the cause of, okay, you and your friends can choose, for example, what to die for, or choose what to live for.
That would be a good plug for basically the right to, go to a physician or a doctor, and they basically sign a paper saying that you can. What is it?
Assisted suicide.
Yeah.
I think that's substantially a different topic, but I'm looking forward to talking about that one specifically.
Right. And so like what I was saying is just to choose one to start with, would it be easier for you to die for liberty, for the ability for people to choose how they want to live and die, so to speak. When you are at the end of your rope versus, in what we could just call a moment of stasis. Maybe a more clear example would be like in World War II. All the fighting was going on away from the United States, the U.S. shores. People at home may have been worried, but they weren't worried about what was going on down the street. But say people are knocking down your door, and here's the moment where you've got to make a choice whether to be captured or die for, liberty. And, is it easier to do that then at the end of your rope at a moment where you're basically screwed either way? Or do you get what I'm saying?
I do. And so like
it's one thing to sign up for the army and be shipped overseas when nothing's going on versus being invaded and essentially having the choice of becoming a prisoner of war or sacrificing yourself for the cause.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's funny that we talk about games. We should eventually do the deep dive into game theory because, it has a lot to say about this sort of thing. And, Brayton, you're 100% correct. I mean, why would I go outside right now and look for a reason to die? You see what I mean?
Right.
I mean, like, why would I go out looking for it? Now, there is actually very easy kind of answer to that. I tell my students this all the time, especially to my female students when they ask me, why did this boy do this? I say, male angst, and then they say, what are you talking about? And I say, in so many words, their inability to deal with their levels of testosterone. I mean, we've all seen it, whether it be in a movie or even in real life for some of us. Some dude or even some woman going out spoiling for a fight. They're looking for that fight, They might not be looking to die, but they could be. Is it easier to do this at the end of your rope? I think the simple answer is yes. But I know exactly what Trevor's going to say. He's going to say, everyone's end of rope is different. I mean, we have to...
Not only, Yeah, not only that, but your rope itself extends and shortens every passing second of every passing day.
Yeah,
I think
the quantum
there have been
rope.
times in my life. There have been times in my life where I could look. I really, truly. I don't know. I really don't.
Well,
but
so,
I can understand.
Trevor,
I can relate to. Huh?
Maybe I can help consolidate your thoughts here a little bit. I'd like to share with you an experiment that I happen to know about, and you guys know I always love to bring this back to some grounded, measurable phenomenon and so on. And this goes along with dying and killing for a cause. There's an experiment that you can do. You can trap barnyard mice in buckets for like trapping them. You know what I mean? And what a lot of people do is they'll put a lethal volume of water in a bucket to where they'll obviously get in there and drown. So it turns out, so far as I know anyway, it turns out that if you have 2 traps set up to drown mice and rats, if you leave a bucket, just leave it alone, see how long the rats last. They will last some amount of time, like in the realm, I think, of like 15 to 30 minutes. They will paddle around in that water, but they'll give up and die. But if you take that second bucket and you take the rat out, or take the rats and mice out, and then trap them again, then they will last for like hours. That, in other words, in a very human way of saying it, it's like you've given that second population of rats hope that that survival is, something that is coming.
Mm-hmm.
And, in other words, maybe everyone's rope is a bit longer than they actually think it is. I know military training is based around that. It's, designed to bombard you with stressors so that you are desensitized and so on. But maybe that'll help you consolidate your thoughts, the rat experiment.
That's a beautiful story. That's a beautiful. The end of that story is beautiful. I really like that. I would bring something up. It might be a bit of an aside, but we saw there's a comment right here from a viewer. That I'm not sure if I'm interpreting this the way that he intends, but he says here, "I would die for a cause to decide how to live," and I think that is also a really interesting claim. Now, incredibly subjective. This is just something that this particular viewer feels, and I honestly feel the same way. There is something out there, for me at the very least, that I can sort of conceptualize reality around. That is to say, it seems to me that life is incredibly absurd, all those sort of things that kind of follow from the philosophy that all four of us are familiar with. You know, life is fundamentally absurd. It's all very strange. The bolted to the ground idness nature of what came before this century and the century before ours seems to have become wettened and loosened to such an extent that we're no longer certain about them, and we're left in our current state now. And in this current state, in this strange world that we exist now, we sort of determine for ourselves as individuals what it is that we want to do, and what are the rules of our games that we can then play. It depends. It very much so varies. But you do have a point, and this is something that varies and co-varies between each and every one of us, and also from time to time. And this is something I really want to talk about, whether on a podcast episode or just sometime with the three of y'all. I had like a semi religious experience that was very strange that just happened to me the other day while I was just walking, just on a walk. It was very strange. Well, we'll get into that later. But it seems to me, with the wettening of the debolting of this, we are left sort of having to decide what to live for, and I think that's tied into, for at the very least conceptually for me at this moment, that's really tied into what you would die for, as they seem to me to be. Well, not a dichotomy. It certainly sounds like it is not necessarily a dichotomy. It does seem to me that one is wrapped into the other when you start to choose how to live. When I choose how to live, I'm also choosing what is worth dying for in that sort of way. The sort of what is your cause and that sort of thing.
But they could be so completely antithetical, which is what interests me, is that you would give up the thing that you are living for to service. That's why I think I was struggling so much with the objectivity thing earlier, is that dying for the cause to live or decide how to live is almost entirely subjective for the person that is giving their life. So if you give up your life for the ability to live, it's almost as if you've got a zero-sum game, like you've net nothing out of that.
Well, so like, Brayton, I would like to talk a little bit about that. You know, maybe we should flip this issue on its head a little bit, but the same issue I have written down here, like as a question, while Trevor was talking there just a moment ago. Let's say that we're all in a situation where the question of dying is actually, on the table. Let's say Tanner gave up, let's say Tanner quit the field, so to speak. Would we persecute him for a coward? I mean, in other words, are people who won't die under any circumstances cowards? My first and fast answer is no. In other words, I would respect anybody's ability and belief to say, yeah, I'm not dying for anything. I don't care how bad my living conditions become. I would rather live. I would completely respect that person's choice, and it is a completely logical choice to me. I think that kind of like what I was saying earlier. I think it comes down to who you care about and how many of them there are, and so on. Mm-hmm. In other words, if it was the case that all three of you were to be thrown in prison for no cause at all, or I could commit suicide, that's a very strange circumstance to be in.
Right.
but I'd really have to think about it. You know what I mean? I'd really, really have to think about it.
I mean, it's really a thing to ponder. I mean,
yeah, and so like I was saying earlier, we can have some measurements in the wild, in wilderness and so on. You're all at least a little related to me. You're all human. Would the triggers in my genes be willing to predispose me to saying, oh yeah, if you three were threatened with life and limb, would I take my own life, or use my own life to protect you three? It's a big question, and we can kind of measure it. We're an aggregate species. We're social species. In other words, I would be dying, Brayton, for your ability and for your potential, if that makes sense. In other words, we share enough genes. We are human. We can say that we all kind of belong to the same psychological village. We're all part of each other's village, so to speak.
Oh man!
So there are some significant advantages to being predisposed to suicidal behavior and sacrificial behavior for the good of the group. But that's what it looks like on the surface, is good of the group. But what it really is good of the genes.
Right.
And your potential and your genes are heavily related.
What's that quote from 2001? All I can hope for is to live my life to its maximum potential.
Yeah.
Oh.
Something like that.
I'd like to quote a Queens of the Stone Age song at this moment. I want something beautiful to die for, to make it beautiful to live. I think that's sort of what I was coming to last time I spoke. This is a subjective thing, but I do have to say it's all wrapped up into itself for me. And I don't know, at least for me, at this time, at this moment, if you were to ask me, I have something worth killing for. I don't think I do. I think it's just sort of an inner optimism.
Your life, you're not thinking about self-defense.
It's just, I believe so much in the potential for things to turn out in such and such a way that wouldn't result in the act of killing someone, the act of taking someone else's life. I have such a glass is half full sort of feeling about it that it intuits me against it. It seems to me that that's sort of something worth dying for in itself, like the idea that this could turn out in such and such a way, like the act of doing such and such a thing that leads towards my own death is itself a cause worth dying for, if that makes sense. The act of pushing away from an act worth killing for is itself my act worth dying for at this moment. If you were to ask Trevor how he feels about this is the way he feels about this. It's almost something worth crying over at this moment. I kind of feel it there.
It's pretty intense. Well, go ahead, Stephen.
Well, so did you hear what I was saying earlier, Trevor? You claimed that you have nothing worth killing for, and I think that's completely false. At least in this country, we kind of agree that if someone is trying to take your life, that you have the unequivocated right to take theirs instead. And I think that is justifiable and fair. In other words, I see here in the audience, our last thing, I see, I'd rather kill for something than die. That's a big question too. Like, which one would you rather do? Once again, situation by situation. But Trevor, you claim that you might not have anything to kill for. I'm not saying I don't believe you. I'm saying that you, Trevor, matter more than the criminal that would be trying to kill you, for example. Or rather, I should say murder you.
I think that's a good example to bring up, the whole self-defense thing, at least in the United States. If somebody's coming to take your life and we say that it's justified to be able to take theirs instead in self-defense, we're saying that this is justifiable because somebody's well-being is at stake. And so at that point it is, we create an exception for basically breaking our moral rules. So I wonder if there's not some sort of odd inverse or twist to that would justify dying, or does that even really need to be justified if we talk in the same sense about things like assisted suicide or even abortion, which will eventually be a conversation where we talk about people's rights to their own bodies. And
we should do assisted suicide and the abortion one in the same go, don't you think?
Yeah, perhaps.
Sure, we can just have bodily autonomy discussion.
Right. But yeah, but exactly that. My point being is like, do you even have to justify dying yourself by your own hand because it is yours?
It's funny. It's funny because, you know, Brayton, even though you and I couldn't care less, there is, for example, a religious belief that suicide is a very bad sin. I think it's a human right, for example, but in other words, everybody has a right to die for the cause that they want to, or however you want to interpret that. I'm fine with it.
Sure.
But
You know,
like,
yeah.
I remember living in Illinois. I went to church quite a bit to see what these people were on about and so on. And I have absolutely no problem at, you know, I'm not going to use the word admitting, because it's not like I'm admitting some kind of fault. I have no problem whatsoever saying that back in a more naive era for Stephen, I was very religious, and I'd go to these churches, try to figure out what they're talking about, what they're doing, and then I ended up meeting some people who were like part of like this Mennonite Christian faith, and I had this deep discussion with some of them about the interpretation of the Decalogue, and in particular, whenever Moses, you know, said that murder is not lawful. Well, in the King James version, it says, you know, you will not kill, and that's the version that they read. And so I started just kind of going down the list. I started asking questions like, "You're telling me right now that your mom wouldn't kill somebody trying to kill you? You want to tell me that lie?" You know what I mean? In other words, you know, surely some of this genetic stuff I'm talking about would you know, predispose them to doing that act. And I think that that's a very good thing. Don't get me wrong. And they said no. This person said no, that he truly believes that in the course of her faith, that his mother, belonging to this religious group, would refuse to kill anyone trying to kill her children. And my reply to that was, I don't believe you. I mean, I don't believe you. I think that when the situation calls for it, humans are capable of anything. And you know, Trevor, you know, you're talking about a lot of deep stuff there for a moment, and I want to appreciate that, and I do appreciate it. But seriously, we are capable of anything at any moment. You know, and oftentimes none of it is reasonable.
Yeah, I think what's happening.
In other words,
is,
you have to acknowledge that the universe is in a high chaos state, literally at all times. It's actually our pattern-seeking brains that puts, you know, things together. Yeah, and I don't have to tell you that.
Yes, absolutely. So I think we can touch on something really interesting here, and this connects to the lengthening while also the shortening of the rope. Let's say that I mentioned earlier, the change of the rules of the game as the game plays and plays and plays throughout time for the subjective perceiver as they establish objectives or posit questions and then find answers for those questions. So at this moment right now, I'm a sort of establishing an ideal with an underlying mythos of how I ought to live. Speaking in terms of dying and killing for a cause, I would tell you right now that life is. If you were to ask me, and I were to get really sentimental right here, right now, I would tell you that life is itself beautiful, and I would say that once you learn to take your tight grip that you have on life and just sort of like on what you consider to be your own once you learn to like let go of the tension, I think you find, and this is an entire episode on itself, I think you find that what is most fundamentally you isn't the ideas that revolve and flow around in your fears and all of these emotions that cloud around. I don't think that that's what fundamentally is Stephen or Brayton or myself for that matter. I think it's what is, and I think that is to say it's sort of that quiet, I guess you could say suchness that you could ascribe towards the quietness of a moment, like a lull or something. And I think that moment, I don't think that moment is itself, I guess you could say, ephemeral or short. I think it always is, and I do think that if you visualize reality according to those means, you live strictly and only towards appreciating life or just living, existing right now at this moment. I think you could very easily conceptualize of a reality where it's about living for a cause, dying for a cause, and in that moment, when you no longer visualize reality according to the means of defeating others in return for this thing, because this thing is itself ephemeral, or this thing is always shared no matter what other people do. You begin just to sort of live according to that ideal or that moment at that time. And so when I speak in those terms now, or when I spoke in those terms before, the terms where you negated saying like, oh, you would kill if given the opportunity, I speak according to those terms at that moment. But this is my most sentimental self speaking to you now when I speak according to these terms. But at the exact same time, I do agree with you that there are other chemistries, that is to say, moments, where I myself have played out the story in my own mind. I've idealized or ideated and conceptualized stories where I defended my family, and it was a beautiful thing at that moment. It was me living out my purpose at that moment. And just like that, the entire thing itself dissolves into many different games being played at many different times according to many different rules. Because I've conceptualized moments where I have defeated my enemies, and my enemies were hateable. Truly, they were evil and defeatable, and my existence was at that moment slaying my enemies, and at that moment also dying. That sort of triumphant. What's that scene from Flash Gordon? What's his name that has flying wings? He laughs and he goes, "Wow, well, who wants to live forever?" And then he yells really loud, "Dive!" And then he dives directly down into the ground. And then Queen plays in the background. Just electric lightning bolts storm through the skies, and it's just this triumphant death and this triumphant killing. If that makes sense. As horrific as that phrase sounds, a terrific killing.
I think
itself.
Trevor's neuroses are showing he's having irrational he's having irrational visualizations of grandeur.
I have these every day, and I'm telling you right now, all of these things are sort of the I would say they're logical conclusions, these neuroses of these ways of visualizing reality, whether it be for killing for a cause, dying for a cause, both of which can be completely antithetical to one another, as well as any other neuroses or any other way of conceiving of reality, any other chess game you want to play. Each of them, you establish rules, you play them out. And I think they all can, your very nature, you, Stephen, the fact that you are aware of other ways of living reality, the fact that you visualize reality as this or that, means that you can visualize reality in multiple ways. You can establish chess, but also checkers, and also tic-tac-toe. You can do all of these things if you wanted to. And I think that sort of layers onto it the fact that each one is itself just a game with its own contrived subjective rules, whether it be Brayton's game of chess or yours or mine at this time. And not only Brayton's game, but Brayton's game today, at this moment, at this time. The story that he's living out right now, not the story he lives out tomorrow or the day after that. I think this shows, and this is emphasized, the subjectivity of the games we play. And I can't help but change because I can't help but be all of these things. If you were to ask me, I can empathize with almost every perspective you could possibly imagine. Truly, I could. Just the other day, a friend of mine told me that he was a Marxist. And I can truly empathize with what it means to be that thing, as well as every other thing. I can put myself there. I could flow into it if I wanted to. All of these things have a story to them that can be played out and felt. They do, and they have. And I think that shows really, truly, how you won't be able to find this dying for a cause thing that is itself objective. Just logical rules that follow from pre-contrived notions. Kind of like, if you don't know, so Euclid, a very I've been talking for a very long time. Feel free to interrupt me if you have something.
I do have something that I think would be of interest to everyone here. I hope you all saw the Dungeons and Dragons movie. If you haven't, you really need to go see it. Have you all seen it?
It was adequate. It was good.
I have not seen it.
Well,
naturally,
Tanner, you need to leave.
Well, Tanner, just so that you understand what I'm bringing up here,
Our boy lives under a rock.
and it's really not of that much importance.
Tanner is the Rock.
Tanner lives under Plymouth Rock. You know what I'm saying?
But there's a scene in the movie where they use I forget what it's called, Speak with Dead or something like that in the actual rule books. But they go around to all these graves, taking people out to speak with them so they can get some information. And if I could do that in real life, and the one person I would go to would be Albert Camus for this discussion. And the reason being is because I've been sitting here looking at my notes, thinking about things that we haven't talked about, and one of those is how self-sacrifice is portrayed in storytelling, which I hope we can get to before the end of this. But the other one is meaning in death. And I started thinking about that. And I realized one of my favorite quotes by Camus is that the meaning of life is whatever is preventing you from killing yourself. And I thought, if there's a quote that we should discuss in this conversation, it's that. You know, the idea that whatever gives your life meaning is what is preventing you actively from doing exactly what we've been talking about.
But see, that's the thing, though, is, let's quote Thomas Harris here, the great Red Dragon, book that he did. For those of us who don't know, Thomas Harris is the dude who wrote Silence of the Lambs and the the Will Graham story with everything. Anyway, Detective Will Graham was asked by a cop, like, okay, hey, is this serial killer gonna stop? And he goes, no, it's what makes him God. I mean, so I'm just saying, Brayden, you could use that to justify anything, and that is unconscionable.
But it is a good way of visualizing reality because those people exist. I mean, the character from Silence of the Lambs. So, Stephen, you know this better than I. What was his name? The actual serial killer, Wallace? Or no, Clarence. Is that correct?
Who are you talking about?
The main killer from Silence of the Lambs, the one that is revealed at the end. It puts the lotion on its skin. His name is Clarence?
Oh, no, his name is James Gumb.
Oh, okay. James Gumb.
You were way off, but it's okay.
Was I? Oh. Anyway, nevertheless, I do think Brayden's way of visualizing reality at this moment is of value. It's substantive because those people do exist. Now, whether or not it's good for what Stephen wants, that is to say, like this humanism, liberal humanism, that's another question. But it is true to say that it is a substantive way of visualizing reality because people like James Gumb do exist. And so does that character that who lives behind the glass screen at the master
Lecter,
character. Yeah, the Lecter character. It's substantive for these sorts of people. And it's also substantive it has some dark, incredibly dark conclusions that follow after it, whether it be Nazi Germany or whether it be Stalin's Russia, or to even it out, I have to come up with some sort of American version of that. I don't know. I'd have to have some sort of
literally.
Yes, just like that, you have it, and it's a good one. The KKK in the United States going around with what's his name, Forrest, the first generation KKK forerunner. You have these people doing these horrible things, and they're horrible for Stephen, but they do fit within that paradigm that Brayden just mentioned. And I do think we do need to explore it all the way down into what it is, as horrible as it is, if we want to be able to understand it and therefore be able to circumvent it. And whether or not, horrifying as this is, whether or not it is something to be circumvented.
But so, like, Trevor, just to combat this with at least a little bit of objectivity for our viewers, why would I say the KKK is wrong? Just fundamentally, even verifiably, it's because their claims are just that. They don't really have arguments for their hatred. They think that they do. Don't get me wrong. A lot of our viewers might not even know what I'm talking about. What's the difference between a claim and an argument? But we'll table that for now. My point is that their preconceptions about race and things like this are just totally false, verifiably. That their thoughts, for example, that people with dark skin are subhuman, we're all one species. That's just verifiably false. So that's why I would say that they're wrong. Hitler, why was he verifiably wrong? Eugenics is bad science. That's why. Easy money. I don't waste my time, in other words. You know what I mean? Why was Stalin just wrong? For example, the lie, the complete contradiction that he told people about Russian crops becoming, all this, that, and the other because of this program. Well, that program had no value, and a lot of people starved. So no, their preconceptions are just wrong, and we can talk about all the subjectivity stuff, but ultimately, me and a lot of our viewers just don't care.
So the other thing I wanted to plug in out of Meaning in Death was the storytelling aspect, and the last note that I have over here is we admire self-sacrifice in storytelling to one of the highest degrees. I think you would all agree it's one of the most emotional elements of a story, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a really good story that doesn't have some form of self-sacrifice. And do we admire that or value it so much? Is it so emotional because of the fact that it is so bewildering? And in addition to that, bewildering in the sense, like Camus said, if the meaning of life is whatever prevents you from killing yourself, you are essentially crossing the threshold of the meaning, and you are going beyond the meaning of your own life by giving up your own.
You are like definitely exploring the unknowable by sacrificing yourself in a story, narrative.
Mm-hmm. And so I've just been thinking about that. I think there's some great examples. One of my favorite, more recent ones, spoilers ahead for Rogue One. It's been out for 7 years. But that's a great example. And then its follow-up, now they have the Andor series. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but absolutely phenomenal in my opinion. One of the greatest pieces of Star Wars media that exists.
Great. Have you checked the chat? I said,
yes.
You were talking earlier, and I said, if you strike me down.
Right. And that's a great metaphor.
Oh no, that moment is timeless when his name was Alec Guinness, right?
Yes.
When Alec Guinness informed Vader that he had no knowledge of what was beyond and so on. Timeless.
And what he's saying is essentially that he will become a martyr. If we looked at that in a real world.
Yeah, even if he didn't become like this Force Ghost business, let's say it was a real situation, he was becoming a martyr.
Right. But exactly that. There's a phenomenal line. Oh, what's his name? That plays Luthen in Andor. Oh, he's got sons that act. Oh, man. Anyway.
Skarsgård?
Yes, Skarsgård. There's a moment in the show where this guy approaches him. I don't quite remember the context, but he goes, well, what do you sacrifice? And amazing scene where he talks about all the things that he's given up for this rebellion. And he says this line where he's like, I burn my life to make a sunrise that I'll never see. Basically talking about the idea that he does all of this and he's given up all of this and he will pretty much sacrifice his life for something that he'll never even get to end up enjoying the spoils of.
Well, the same quote is attributed to some philosopher. I can't remember exactly which one right now, but it says something along the lines of society cannot work unless old men plant trees in which they will never share the shade in.
Oh man, that's good.
That's literally the same exact line, just using different language. Using different prose to express the same exact idea. And that's ultimately what I mean by, like, there are objectively measurable benefits to our genes predisposing us to sacrificial behavior. For example, if we encounter another species, say, of some kind of, deep reptile somewhere, maybe their genes don't predispose them to sacrificial behavior on the part of their fellows. Maybe they're completely solitary beings except for mating season and so on.
Or perhaps maybe we don't find those because all of the ones that don't exist anymore.
True. Now, of course, anybody who knows anything would tell you that mammals are more aggregate in general, and so that's all
Sure.
why I brought up the example of the reptile. But my point is, there are, at least in some ways, measurable benefits that come out of humans sacrificing their lives for fellow humans.
I think that one's a very obvious truth. And I think you'd have very many angry people coming at you if you disagreed.
But it kind of goes back to what I said once again. Like, if someone informed me, hey, by the way, I'm a coward, like if he used this language or she used this language, I'm a coward. I'm not dying for anything. I don't care what my living situation is. I'm not dying. Like, I would completely and 100% respect that person.
Mm-hmm. But which is so interesting too, because oftentimes in media and stories, when we find those characters that are cowards, we don't like them.
Yeah, no. Me and my friends watched Pineapple Express the other day, and they did this whole montage at the end of the film. And there's these two guys rolling up on this big drug den with guns and shit like that. And then the one that like the story is trying to get you to hate the whole time. He goes, "Yeah, fuck this. I'm not doing this." Like, you know what I mean? He's like, "No, I can't do it." And look, I felt myself. I could understand that me as a child or me as a teenager would be sat there going, "Oh my God, he's a coward. Look at him."
Right.
And then me as an adult, I'm like, oh no, he's being actually completely reasonable. He's going against like these drug lords and they don't care about the law. He's actually being completely reasonable. He needs to go home, go find another place to live and change his name.
Yeah.
That's what he do.
Yeah, there's one thing about this conversation too that we haven't really touched on, and I don't know how much there would be to say on it, just because we've already talked about sort of the idea that we can measure the effects of people sacrificing themselves for a cause. And one of the most obvious ones that we have not touched on is religious self-sacrifice, which is very common in our history.
Look at all the Catholic saints.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity has plenty of examples, not particularly more recently. That credit goes to Islam, I would imagine. But perhaps to a certain degree, there are many different religions in which people, I mean, even Eastern religions, they're no stranger to self-sacrifice. Honor. We talk about
honor killing, stuff like that.
What's the word I'm looking for? Samurai, seppuku. The whole idea of preventing yourself from being dishonorable, or the monks in the East that would self-immolate or do any number of other things, not eat to the point of death for different causes. I wonder, we could talk about what makes them different from somebody who, say, goes off to fight Nazis in Germany or something like that.
I was about to say that there are substantial reasons why, say, a parent would forego food for the sake of their children. And by the way, in different species, not ours, there are lots of reasons why another species might sacrifice the young for the old. It just actually depends on the species. But in our species, we protect the young, and nearly everyone has those instincts to do so. There's a very big difference between, say, a parent foregoing food for their children and a religious person. I'm not trying to compare all religions to the KKK, but I said earlier that the presuppositions of the KKK are just verifiably wrong, and
Right.
the unfalsifiable claims of religions where they try to explain too much, that's the reason why these people are dying. Of course it is, and those are not good reasons to die for.
Right, and I thought that's probably why that would be maybe a relatively short discussion, but I did want to make sure that we touched on it, was just because, like I said, we had already discussed that some things are more demonstrably unreasonable.
Sure, and I mean, a suicide bombing is one of the most unreasonable things someone can do. Not only am I going to sacrifice myself for the well-being of the deity, I'm also going to kill a bunch of other people on my way out. It's unconscionable. It's nonsense.
Trevor, did you have a point? I can hear you thinking.
Well, I worry about this because I want to agree with all
don't.
three of you.
This is why I'm so interested to hear from Trevor, because he inevitably always finds a way to turn something back at us.
No, it's just I have these weird schizophrenic worries where I'm never quite certain about anything, and I leak that onto the three of you. That's just the way this goes.
Yeah, Trevor, before you say what you want to say, I'm also deeply curious about what you want to say. We are encroaching on 9 o'clock. That's the first thing I want to say. And number 2, if you haven't read The God Delusion, where he talks about genes and mimetic things being very, very similar. In other words, memes, not as in what we use it like today, like funny pictures and shit like that. Memes is in like religion is a mimetic thing. It's like it's like an idea that comes prepackaged with a replicator in that you teach people about it and so on. My point here is that there's a lot of comparison to be had there, like genes and memes and things like that. And some genes are verifiably not good for the survival of the species or the survival of the gene or the survival of the individual or whatever. And some ideas are not good for survival either.
This is a lot like what Dan Dennett is talking about in his book Breaking the Spell, which parrots a lot of, Stephen, what you were talking about with Richard Dawkins, whether it be from the God Delusion or something more of the evolutionary books. Sort of the idea that religion is exactly that. It is mimetic. However, there is something about religion. He uses the legal phrase cui bono, like who benefits from this. Someone must benefit, otherwise we would not still have these traditions that have been passed down. And so I wonder where the benefit of religion lies in that, and how things like when we mentioned the saints, these martyrs, even Jesus Christ himself, all these other, I imagine that for a Muslim that is not sickened by the idea of jihad or suicide bombings, that they look at these people. I mean, Sam Harris says it in his book that, I mean, the families of these people who go off and kill themselves are praising that act, and
because they're nuts.
Well,
of course, but
so this makes it. This is where it gets difficult, and I think I'll close my part at least right here. This is where it gets really difficult, because I would really like to exist with y'all here in this space, that way of seeing things at this moment. But at the same time, I worry. I mean, we're talking about humans, other people, other individuals that a lot of the time can be very intelligent and very interesting and very clever. And I worry that we sort of. This is going to sound strange at first, but I swear it does make sense after I open it up a little bit. I worry that we're creating, I guess you could call them straw men of these ideas, and then we destroy these straw men. In the act of destroying them, well, this is exactly what I mean. On the face of it, it seems like I'm being facetious, or like I'm not quite looking at it properly. But if you just so. When we're creating these straw men and attacking these straw men at this moment, now we can lay out these objective things and then answer those questions according to those. We could ask the objectives. We can ask these questions and sort of derive answers from them, and then that sort of way we could sort of see answers and can sort of explain, characterize, and understand our opposition or other ways of visualizing reality according to those means. That is to say that you could look at Stalin in terms of him lying about farm quotas, or you could look at Hitler, as terrifying as this is. You could look at Hitler in terms of his genocide, or if you look at the United States, if you're going to be a communist in like the 1980s. Or the 1960s, you can visualize all of the United States in terms of the KKK. How you characterize it, all of it just comes back to the hatred between the classes and the races, and how the United States is necessarily and always a farce, according to those means. I think you can understand what I'm getting at here. You can characterize according to these means. Like, for example, I remember I got into a horrible rabbit hole. I had to uninstall all my social media recently. It's just so bad. But I got into a rabbit hole of
Good for you.
Islamic point of views of secular philosophy, of secularism and humanism, and they constantly come back to the same thing. We're all just, this is going to be gross. We're all just like, we talk about being humanist and all this kind of stuff. And then as soon as we get home, we go off and do BDSM. They use these words. I swear to God.
So, like,
We're degenerates. We don't have any reason to do anything.
Right.
And they look at us in these straw men.
I would like to bring us back to reality here.
Please.
We have to quote him at least once, okay? It's becoming a meme. Our frontal lobes are too small. Our adrenal glands are too big.
Too large.
Thus saith the Lord,
too...
Christopher Hitchens.
Christopher Hitchens.
But yeah, my point here is that of course humans are irrational beings at times. I'm very guilty and very proud of saying that persons are awfully intelligent. Trevor, the person, is awfully intelligent. It seems like as soon as we get in groups of more than 10, we lose our minds. We give subtle permissions to each other to do things we wouldn't otherwise do, such as die for a cause. If I had to interject a little bit in there. All I'm really trying to say is that it is very tempting, and believe me, I'm not nearly as certain as my voice, tends to project me as. Okay, I'm not, of course, 100% certain that that my ideas are the correct ones. If I were, I wouldn't be here, and if I did believe that, I wouldn't be very interested in what we have to say here.
Right. You'd be somewhere else, probably up your own ass, like a lot of people out there. That's just how it is.
Exactly. Only a narcissist could ever say that. I'm right in almost all cases whatsoever.
So I'll finish my idea right here, and then we'll cut at least my part of it. So the reason I brought all that up is to say that the answers to your questions are in fact correct. The way you visualize Nazi Germany at that moment, Stephen, or the KKK, was correct. But the questions themselves that gave you correct answers to those questions, sufficient answers to those questions. The questions in themselves are based on a purview or a paradigm that exists within Stephen. That is to say, you poke around with a flashlight in your hand in a dark room, and the directions where you point the flashlight is itself, and the flashlight you actually hold are themselves based on you. And it's kind of like the perspectivism used by like Nietzsche, for example. You can look at it from many different perspectives based upon your own purview, and you can get correct answers based upon your questions. But then you come to realize that we're all asking different questions at that moment, and just like that, everything just sort of flows into this strange cacophony of various perspectives with various levels of validity that themselves are based upon pre-assertions that themselves are from different people, and everything just sort of molds into all sorts of things. I mean, look how much people hate like the United States, whether it be Americans themselves, because there's no one an American loves to hate more than other Americans. That's just the way it is. But if you just look at the way people visualize the United States, it has been characterized and then slapped down in a way you can characterize them as straw men so many fucking times. It's so easy to just slap it down because it is. Because you could, in fact, ask questions that result in answers that themselves render the United States as being disgusting and horrifying and terrible and a horrible net negative for the world. There are questions you could ask that net result in that answer. And in the same way, you could do the same thing in Nazi Germany or communism in China today or Japanese imperialism.
I'm going to try and get this into some plain language for us. What I believe you're saying is that we should be able to imagine the perspective of very, like, even radically different people than ourselves. Is that correct?
Is that to say that it is useful to you to do so?
No, I'm saying that, like, in other words, every reasonable person should be able to identify the most human elements within any perspective.
I think what I'm trying to do whenever I do this is I'm trying to broaden the perspective here, but that's not to say that everyone must do it, or even that a smart person would do this.
Well, what
There
I'm
are plenty of
saying is
people
that,
smarter
like,
than I that don't.
what I'm saying is that it's actually part of our education in this country to challenge students to do that. For example, I mean, think about all the critical thinking questions you encountered back in the day. What I'm trying to say is that only a fool would never consider the perspective of other people. That's really what I'm trying to say.
Mm.
Well, Tanner, does that wrap us up?
Does anybody have anything else to say in closing, or is that going to be it?
I guess.
Well, we should do the go down the line thing, of course.
It flutters out this episode.
Trevor, what are your conclusions?
Well, I think I just kind of came up with it just then. It's all subjective.
Yeah, that's probably
Oh no,
Trevor's.
I think I can start the crowd.
Boo.
Steven?
yeah. I won't speak much to conclusions. I'm not going to tell the audience what they should and should not believe. What I am going to say is kind of like what I was just talking about. Only a fool could never imagine the perspective of another human being. Don't forget to neuter your cats and integrate your dark side. In other words, no matter how evil a perspective is, like Trevor's saying, you should be able to think about things from their perspective, even if it hurts your feelings and sensibilities. You should do it. It hurts my feelings and sensibilities to imagine things from a religious perspective. But I can do it, and I do it often, to understand where they're coming from so that I don't hate them. So, in closing, be most excellent to one another.
I think if I had to conclude on something, it's that I am still just as perplexed by this question as I was at the beginning. But I will say that my desire for clarity has definitely been granted. Something to think about, and I think maybe it's part of that, like I was saying towards the end with the whole Camus quote and things, is because this question is so bewildering, that is what makes the concept of self-sacrifice, both in real life and in storytelling, albeit storytelling has a lot more brushes with which to paint the picture with, makes it such a grand thing and such a almost universal aspect of a great story, is that there is a great sacrifice, if not often a life involved. Love that.
Well, our lovely listeners out there, that concludes this episode of the Four Mortal Coils podcast. As always, we encourage any interaction, any questions, and anything you might happen to want to say to us, or any of us. So please feel free to follow us everywhere, and join our Discord if you should feel the need.
All right, favorite self-sacrifice quotes and go.
It's definitely Alec Guinness.
Wait, hang on. Let me find it.
Fly, you fools.
Yes, dude. Yes. I mean, oh boy went down there to harvest XP so that they wouldn't get their cut.
I mean, we are glossing over the other one of the movie, which is, the redeemed character. I would have followed you, my captain, my king.
Exactly. In other words, he died in a very narrative sense. Like, in other words, human life is not so well ordered as this. You know what I mean?
Right.
Karma isn't real. You know what I mean?
Right. And that's exactly what I meant by having more brushes to paint with. Is
yeah.
But it's funny that we say that, because we almost, or at least I speak for myself when I say that we almost have to envision a sort of narrative for our own lives in order to frame the meaning that we ascribe to it.
Like, whenever you and Trevor were talking about that, I couldn't help but think about the Nietzsche idea of the Übermensch, like this Superman who will presuppose his own ideas and so on and so forth. Sounds very narcissistic to me, but whatever.
But it's like if you had the choice between just dying on a whim whenever that would happen, or choosing a death that fits some sort of self-gratifying narrative, I feel most people would choose one that fits some sort of self-gratifying narrative, despite the fact that...
Speak for yourself. I wish to die old and surrounded by family,
Oh, right.
Well, right. Can you hear me okay? Does my audio come in?
It's okay.
Do you remember,
okay enough.
You remember in Tenet, whenever he meets Sator for the first time, and he's like, "How would you like to die?" And John David Washington's like, "Old."
Yes, dude, old.
Well, here, I really want to talk on this. Somebody mentioned the Ubermensch, and suddenly I'm interested again. Listeners, my laptop straight up died, so I'm talking through a phone. But to the thing that Steven said about like the sort of perspective of the Ubermensch, or the one who chooses, the way I look at it is essentially all of reality up till this point. Whenever we're talking about like dying for this or serving God or any of these things, there comes a point in your life where you realize that all of it was itself something that welled up from within the individual. Someone at that moment, at that time, declared that I am, and I will live according to these means, and this is what is. And they put it in poetry and a story. Yahweh means I am. Jesus, when there's a story of Jesus before Abraham, I am. So you speak through these stories, but you come to realize that they themselves are stories within you, a decision that you yourself made here and now. When you come to realize that, people can come up and ask you, well, why don't you want to kill anyone? Or why do you want to do this? Or why do you want to do that? Or whatever thing, even the most profane. It comes down to, I do it because I am, and I want to do it because I say it. And it's that realization, because it always has been that way. When you come to realize that you can do it, and it is something you're capable of doing, I think that is itself what you could ascribe to the Superman or the Ubermensch, the one who declares, the one who establishes.
Right. But so like the only trouble I have with that, of course, I'm perfectly willing to say that we're constantly acting out the ideal that we think we are. You know what I mean? None of us here should be any stranger to those terms. Like, we're constantly trying to enact. We're trying to act with other people, especially this idea of ourselves. All of that is well understood. But for religion specifically, if we interpret religion as a natural phenomenon, as it must be, it's part of nature. In other words, Dawkins supposes, and so do other people, that it's a misfiring in the brain, according to narratives and things like that. Comparing it to the false positive of seeing a shadow and thinking that it's the ghost and so on. Here's the thing: for someone to say I am, and in the way that you're talking about, Trevor, in the literal biblical sense, where they, do their own actions on their own free will, I completely disagree. Just take religion specifically. I do not care how misinformed a suicide bomber is. They are misinformed. They didn't do this on their own free will. Their genes are literally screaming at them to try and stop them. Children know the difference between right and wrong, that sort of thing. And it's not hard to see why they've been misinformed. In other words, you say that it's this I am part of them welling up. I disagree. They have been misinformed. They cannot provide informed consent to blow themselves up. That's why I don't necessarily hate suicide bombers. I hate what they do, if that makes sense. And I hate the people who led them to do it. In other words, if some priest is telling them, hey, you should go kill yourself in the name of this God, it's like, why not you, dude? Like, why aren't you doing this?
Oh, about when Brayton asked for that quote on a self-sacrifice.
Yeah,
I'm sure we're all familiar with the American Civil War, right?
Yeah.
No.
Oh no.
Well, out of the American Civil War came one of, I think, the best written poems of the 19th century, which ironically enough, is the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Yeah, dude.
In that particular poem, there's a line in it that goes like this. With a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me, as he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. It's not memeable, but I do believe that is one of the best expressions of the Northern cause that I can really use to summarize that part of the Civil War.
Yeah, in other words, if you believe in the Jesus myth that he died vicariously for your sins and, so on and on, it, like Trevor's saying, that could be a great motivator for you to be like, oh, well, I can do this same thing. That's the most human part about the tale, is that it's not actually a god, dying for your sins. It's, the best you could ever say. Let me just go ahead and say that all of the myth is true, except for maybe the miracles and so on. Maybe some dude really did die in Palestine for this, that, or the other. That's the human part of it. That's the actually really good part of it. That, this Christ dude would die so that others might, benefit. That's the most human idea there. And, if you believe in that, that could bring you to a point where you truly think you should die for another's freedom. And that's fine. It's just misinformed.
Hey, the Civil War, that's that one with radical abolitionist John Brown, isn't it?
Oh, man. Well, anyway, what I said for the audience doubly goes for you people. Be excellent to one another.